objection? Seeing none, you may proceed with summarization, sir.
Thank you. The amendment provides for a methodology to calculate the spending cap for purposes of general fund expenditures and a procedure to vary from the calculations. To the extent that the expenditures presented in this bill are in excess of the spending cap within the amendment, the General Assembly would not be allowed to authorize the expenditures. Basically, what this does is that it strikes out Section 35 of what is now the bill, what had been House A, and would restore the calculations to the methodologies that we have been using since the spending cap was first enacted as a legislative enactment in 1991. And I would move adoption.
Question before the chamber is adoption of House Amendment D. Will you remark, sir?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I would. Thank you very much. If I may, perhaps I could ask a question of the chair of the Appropriations Committee.
Representative Walker, please prepare yourself. You may proceed, sir.
Thank you. Section 35 in the underlying bill before us now changes the methods by which the spending cap is to be calculated. Is that correct through you, Mr. Speaker?
Representative Walker.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that is correct.
Representative O'Neill.
And it accomplishes that by changing the definitions of what constitutes the base of the spending cap and also the fiscal years versus the calendar years by which the rates of increase are to be calculated. Is that correct through you, Mr. Speaker?
Representative Walker.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that is correct. What we did is we use calendar year as opposed to fiscal year. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's my understanding of what the impact of the amendment that is before us is. Since 1991, and I was here in the Assembly when we enacted the spending cap that year, we have always calculated the spending cap based on the fiscal years and not used the calendar years. One of the consequences of switching to a calendar year is that it changes the amount of increase that is allowable under the spending cap and makes it possible for this budget to be considered, if this section is adopted and is considered appropriate and legitimate, it would allow the spending to be done because it would seem to be within the terms of the spending cap. In addition, and much more substantially in terms of the amounts of change, by taking hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that had previously been part of the base of the spending cap out from under the spending cap, it redefines the spending cap. What the amendment does is basically restores us to the situation that we have always utilized as we have calculated the spending cap. Now, this is important, Mr. Speaker, because the spending cap, to be redefined pursuant to the Constitution, requires a 3/5 majority of both chambers. And that is not just 3/5 of those who actually happen to be voting on that particular day, but 3/5 of all of the people who are sitting within the who are members of the chamber. That would be about 90 votes, Mr. Speaker, which, based on what happened as the amendment was adopted initially, clearly was not present. Therefore, if this budget with the Section 35 in it that's there now were to proceed, it would be unconstitutional and in violation of the state spending cap because these modifications and redefinitions were not done in accordance with the constitutional provision for the spending cap. We would be, I think, in serious trouble if that, in fact, is allowed to go forward. The problem with, of course, the budget is that the budget exceeds the existing spending cap with the existing definitions, which have been the ones that we have been using consistently and in most cases unanimously consented to, or many cases unanimously consented to during the last 20 years or so that the spending cap has been in effect. Now, I just quickly and I believe that the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee did a very good job of explaining what the changes were to the base. But I would like to just briefly mention that the reason we have a spending cap is to try to restrain the growth in spending. This came about in 1991 along with the income tax because there had been such a steady and uncontrolled growth in the spending of the state of Connecticut that it led us from one crisis to another crisis to another crisis till finally we had no other choice as a state but to adopt massive tax increases, and the biggest tax increase of all was the state income tax. At that time it was promised that the state income tax was going to solve our permanent, perpetual problem of crisis and financing. Obviously, it has not done that. We had a crisis 4 years ago, billions of dollars of deficits. We have a crisis this year, and according to OFA, that crisis will continue through next year and the year after. And we are facing a very, very serious problem with our finances. Now, the problem with spending, of course, is that it does lead to the tax increases. And the tax increases that we are talking about here today, again, have been, I think, well understood and discussed previously by the other speakers who dealt with that. We've heard from some of our largest corporations about how those tax increases, particularly the tax increases on computer services, are going to have a very serious effect on their decisions about whether to stay in Connecticut. We've all heard about General Electric. We've all heard about the insurance companies. What you may not have heard about is IBM. They wrote to me, in particular, to tell me that if these tax increases go forward, that they're going to have to think very seriously about whether to stay in Connecticut. They wrote to me, the long-term stakes are too high, the competition is too fierce for us to make such a costly mistake, that is increasing these taxes on data processing, based on short-term considerations. The short-term consideration being to get as much money as we possibly can, as quickly as we can, from whatever source we can. It is having a devastating effect on our economy. The way we control the spending, control the taxes, is to control the spending. And the way we've controlled the spending in the state of Connecticut is by following the spending cap. The proposal that is before us today eviscerates the spending cap. It all but obliterates it for all practical purposes. And it is necessary that we restore the spending cap, because that is the only likelihood that we are going to avoid tax increase after tax increase after tax increase going forward. So, Mr. Speaker, I would request that when the vote is taken on this amendment, that it be taken by roll.
Question before the chamber is a roll call vote.